向こうにいる敵全部殺せば俺たち自由になれるのか?
What if I told you that Attack on Titan should have ended right here? Well, kind of. The entirety of the plotline to Attack on Titan is complicated to say the least. And as much as we might have thought we had known in terms of tying up loose ends at this point, we in reality had only scratched the surface of what truths there still were to uncover, leaving the final season, whatever that means to these guys, to be infinitely more game-changing and world-breaking than anything we've witnessed up to this point. Welcome to Figuring Out Fantasy, where I'll be laying out the idea of how Attack on Titan's plot could have gone another route than what they chose when transitioning to the final act of the storyline, and how it was a crime for Marley's origins to only have gotten as much attention as it did. I overall love what I've watched out of the final season so far, and am anxiously awaiting the true finale coming this fall. But that doesn't mean that Isayama couldn't have given me more. If you enjoy deep dives on all things fantasy, from anime to League of Legends to Elden Ring and more, be sure to subscribe to continue getting my videos in your feed and comment your thoughts on your favorite topics. To start, I'm going to reiterate that I thoroughly enjoy the course of the final season in its entirety, but it's for that reason that I emphasize that there should have been a different direction taken to even further display character growth mirroring the Eldians that we've already come to know. When we're first introduced to Marley in the 4th season, we immediately identify how while there are drastic environmental changes surrounding the action, there are many themes that resonate similarly to what we had experienced with the scouts on Paradis. Each of the warrior candidates combined to resemble the young innocent core that grew up within the walls, but this time it's in a full circle manner. Gabby and Falco specifically, while just a duo, are nearly identical to the personality splits within the trifecta of Eren, Armin, and Mikasa. Gabby shares many character traits and circumstances with Eren, as she is blatantly a victim of her own environment, and the more time we have with her, the more we root for her in the same way we did with the Titan Shifter back in Season 1. Our attachment to Gabby is further cemented through her interactions with Falco Grice, little brother to Colt, and fellow member of the warrior candidates. As I mentioned, there isn't a third key character piece to reflect our previous beloved trio, but the similarities on the ends of Mikasa and Armin come directly from Falco alone. While Gabby brings the reckless decision-making and hot-headed nature we identified with Eren, Falco took on the protection and attachment traits we saw in Mikasa, and the emotionally aware ones that made Armin so special. As soon as we start to understand more about these unfamiliar characters, their developments quickly start to intertwine with the course of the events of the main story as further and further reveals set themselves in place. In episode 5 of the final season, we see the quiet but terrifyingly intense conversation between Eren and Reiner, with Falco even being a core piece in the instrumenting of the event on Eren's end. And from that moment on, we're up to date with the Survey Corps and their progress. Sure, there's further development for these characters as the season goes on, but it isn't without the interaction of characters that we've already engaged with prior. Though this doesn't exactly apply for all characters, like Reiner for example. As I talked about in my video concerning whether or not Reiner was truly at fault in the breaking of Wall Maria, there's an incredible amount of depth to his origins and what led him to the most influential moments from his time in the show. And the early portions to the final season really start to give us a peer into his childhood, even with a view from his perspective on his trip from Marley with Annie and Berthold towards that fateful day on Paradis. But it felt like there was even more potential there, not just for Reiner, but for all the characters and the environment that surrounded the circumstance. For all of the interactions with characters like Gabby and Falco without influence from the Survey Corps in some way to cease from the 4th episode, seems like a missed opportunity to jam-pack even more political and moral influence in a show already oozing with conflict from it. Nearly the entire point of introducing the Marleyan side in such a formal and thorough manner was to present just how similar these two warring regions were, and for us to have even further pause when Eren decides to execute the horrific rumbling. This point is certainly gotten across as there are numerous gut-wrenching moments we witness later on in the season that without any of this context may have just been seen as simply Eren enacting his well-earned revenge. But why wasn't there more to Marley before Eren came barging in? As we've already experienced over the past 3 years, these guys certainly don't mind milking their franchise to death with Part 2 of Special Force Subsection 3 being released this fall. So I'll bring this back to when I mentioned that Attack on Titan should have ended at the sea. Hear me out, but what if the final season wasn't directly after the end of the 3rd season, but instead there was a supplementary season placed as a middleman between the two, acting as a ground-up introduction to all the operations of Marley, just as we were introduced to the world within the walls on Paradis. This would give the viewer a true opportunity to go through the trials and tribulations with Gabby, Falco, and the rest of the warrior candidates, as well as diving deep into the briefly explored relationship between Annie, Reiner, and Berthold, solidifying bonds and attachments that would almost make us forget about what we had watched prior in the show. By the second or third episode of being with the gang on Marley, I almost didn't want it to end, and hoped for there to be more supplementary context for their motivations as they conflict with what we had already learned. But there was always that looming wonder of just when we were going to see a familiar face that brought us back home to something we were comfortable with, and this reuniting would come much sooner than many may have been anticipating. And while exciting when we get that first line of dialogue from a mysterious long-haired man with an eye bandage, confirming that our beloved main character was once again in our presence, looking back I can only wish it came a little later. Outside of the characters we wish to get to know a bit better, Eren himself is realistically the biggest reason why there should have been expansion upon the origins of Marley and just what kind of people there were across the sea. The most gripping dilemma of the last season was slowly coming to terms with the fact that we may not be rooting for the perceived main character any longer, as he began to show signs of diverting from the scouts. And one of the ways that Attack on Titan presented this conflict was through allowing Eren to interact with the citizens of Marley and determine for himself whether or not he was justified in carrying out his intentions. But looking back now, we understand that he was never going to change his course of action. He had seen what was to happen, and his goal was now to understand why or what it would do for the world and those around him he cared about. And it still boils down to Eren being in the driver's seat. He controls the narrative at all times, but some of the most compelling portions of the earlier stages to the final season were getting to know just who lived across the sea, just who was behind the destruction of the walls, and whose deaths would grant freedom to a boy who felt wronged from the beginning of it all. So shouldn't there have been just a bit more emphasis on this crucial region of Attack on Titan? After all, beyond the conflict involving Eren's personal motivations, Marley was a key player in the development of the Titans and their dominance over military powers. To briefly summarize, the Eldians and Marleyans waged war against one another throughout time, until the Eldians were able to gain the upper hand through King Fritz splitting Ymir into 9 different Titan powers, and using their otherworldly ability to dominate the Marleyans and hold them under thumb for quite some time. Though once the kingship is transferred from Fritz, the Marleyans are able to equalize the everlasting conflict by gaining control of 7 of the 9 Titan powers, and stay on their revenge tour up till when we begin our time with the show. The entire weight of understanding that Marley is just another side of the same coin as Paradis comes from knowing that this history plays such a large factor in the motivations of what we're currently witnessing in the story. The sole reason why we as watchers believe that our group of characters are lashing out in revenge against mindlessly aggressive enemies is because the other side is perceived as just that, mindlessly aggressive enemies who are shooting fish in a barrel for no good reason other than their own pleasure. Knowing how the walls are made after there's a new king in control of the Eldians, who then wipe the memories of all those within, is crucial to working through character motivation. To now be approaching the clash with this context, we understand that the Marleyan Titan shifters were acting simply on the other side of an everlasting war, and it makes us question why we were given such a brief introduction to the intricacies of the other side of the show. What if, after visiting the sea and Eren asking the famous question, the series ended, but only temporarily? In my personal headcanon, a new season under a different title would have taken place of the traditional Attack on Titan releases. But here we would start from a similar time as we're introduced to Eren, Armin, and Mikasa, this time instead with Reiner, Berthold, and Annie. Further and further context would be provided as we see events from their perspective, and deeper dives on how they interacted with characters like Zeke would key us into the source of the motivation towards all of their missions. The series would continue up to the point where Falco begins his contact with Eren, but at this point the idea of Eren and those associated with him as characters who we root for has long since been forgotten, and it would give us a more contextual approach to the final stages of the series. Some may argue that this idea of dissolving our innate attachment to the characters we've watched over so many seasons would be a detriment to the impact of the final course of events, but in both scenarios it would be just as easy to understand who the person in the wrong is. It is and always has been Eren. So while the gut-wrenching extermination of Marleyan people is understood and deeply felt in the iteration we have now, why couldn't we see it on just that much deeper of a level? Why couldn't Eren crying to Ramsay be even more of a tear-jerking moment? Why couldn't Reiner's revenge on Zeke be even more sweet? So many more to list off, but you get the point. I have such a massive admiration for this series in its entirety for the leaps it takes and the misdirections it won't hesitate to throw at you at every turn. And it's for this very reason that I just want more. There are many OVAs out there that are amazing for providing that much needed context for the relationships of so many scouts that we come to know and love, but even one of those for Marley would have been greatly appreciated in making the final specials for the show feel just that much more earth-shattering. If you made it till the end, thanks for watching. Like I said, if you have some thoughts, make sure to comment them below. I read and reply to as many comments as I can, as it's one of the most enjoyable parts about making videos.
ガビ、うど、
まあね、
ゾフィア、
普通です。
ファルコ、
どうも。ねえ、私たちレベリオの本部に帰れるんだって。それまでにこの街を回ろう。